There was a lot of reporting about this last week as temperatures rise in France, and there's rumors about that it may be somehow related to carbon, but David, I don't think it's the traditional temperature rise that people, as you've shown us, hoaxsters try to link to carbon, a fertilizer gas, as you've said, right? Carbon dioxide.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very interesting, this yellow vest movement, Gilets jaunes, they call it in French, in Paris. I mean, it's taken France by storm. But apparently what always happens, and I've been reading into it, because it seems to me there's an opportunity there, but those kind of movements are not protected very well against man-in-the-middle attacks. So it's bifurcating or trifurcating, or whatever the word is, into multiple groups that include, right-wing extremists, left-wing extremists, and that gives an opportunity for the characters that orchestrate these movements, the people in the shadows, to say that they're extremists and demons. And apparently in Egypt, if you put on a yellow vest now, you get arrested.
Really?
As an extremist. And I had thought, and we had discussed before the show, might it be interesting for us to take a stance on the yellow vest movement? But I think it's too risky, because whatever you do, you don't want to be partitioned or recognized as an extremist, right?
Well, certainly not. I mean, I've never been one to, join groups. You and I have spoken about Greek life, fraternities and things like that. And I was not in a fraternity in college. I think a lot of those groups encourage, the whole mob mentality. So I think what you and I are doing is very important, speaking about the yellow vest movement and doing shows like this to point out what it may or may not be about. I also find it amazing the way they spin it. I mean, everybody on the news that was covering it at all was saying that there's a protest against a gas tax, etc. But when you look at some of the people who are there on the ground, like Luke Radowski and everything, it seems to be much more than that, David. It seems to be the French expression of the worldwide resistance to globalism, which in the United States, of course, I think manifested itself in the election of Donald Trump.
Well, globalism, they're one of those isms that you basically, it's almost impossible to get your head around it. One man's globalism and is another isolationism, if you see what I mean. What intrigues me is the possibility that you have a malign force that has captured much of the technologies that we relate to systems described in the patent office, programmed those technologies with, quote, artificial intelligence, fuzzy logic, and expert system algorithms to create the impression of a globalist force when in fact I would argue it's a criminal force.
But aren't those criminals sort of, it's an international group, isn't it, David? So
yes. But if we call it a global group, it doesn't help us ultimately bring these people to court. And you've rightfully pointed out, because I was discussing the Yellow Pages, that you thought my intent was to look for the Sherman murder solution, if you will, and that you're partly right, except that we make a mistake strategically. And I think I used that metaphor, and I'm not sure it's a very good one, last show, where on one eye you need a microscope and the other eye you need a telescope. You need to see the little picture and the big picture. Right? Yeah. And the Sherman's it's got two aspects to it. One has got a very detailed, specific set of clues at the crime scene, right, which includes belts around the necks of these two poor individuals, excuse me, hitched to the railing of their indoor swimming pool, and a totally bizarre report or announcement by the Ontario Police spokesperson that the implication was that it was a murder homicide, and so it was a murder of Honey Sherman, but they weren't looking for anyone else. Yet when the family hired some private investigators and they did an autopsy, or second autopsy as I understand, they noticed abrasions on the wrists of this couple, consistent with straps. They couldn't make out whether they were tied in front of them or behind them, but it's certainly highly unlikely that the husband would strap his wrists and hang himself after hanging his wife. So what happened is you got a fake news planted in the Ontario Police communication system at the beginning from which they had great deal of trouble to recoil or retreat from, but ultimately they decided it's a double homicide. Now think of the gap between deciding it's a double homicide and treating it immediately as a double homicide, where you put out an all stations alert for anyone seen moving suspiciously near the Sherman household, right?
Right. Now, David, I think I'm showing one of the autopsy photos of, I'm not sure if this is probably one subject that we're looking at here. Have you found a lot of autopsy photos from this murder?
No, not a lot. And is it clear from where you looked that that is the Sherman murder, is it?
That's what the link said. It says Barry Sherman 2017. Let's visit this site and see what it is exactly. I mean, it's certainly consistent with someone having a belt around their neck. I don't know what this low gratis ES is. It looks like a pretty questionable site, but I mean, this image does, we need to figure out why. The strange case of Apotex founder Honey Sherman and wife. So there are mistakes here. I'm not sure that this is a reliable image. And obviously, you know, autopsy photos aren't necessarily released to the public, are they?
No, absolutely not. And I think it took a long time before anyone saw the John Benet Ramsey images. But let me come back to that murder and just see if we can relate it to the Yellow Vest movement. So my argument would be that many of these mass casualty crime scenes or high-value target crime scenes, they have a common signature. And very often for the high-value target crime scenes, you've got this obsession, if you will, with strangulation, including the John Benet Ramsey murder and the Sherman murder. And from a metaphorical point of view, isn't it interesting? I was going to ask you if you happen to know, when people die because of strangulation, are they dying because of a lack of oxygen or an excess of carbon dioxide? Have you got any ideas on that? And maybe the listeners have any ideas?
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I mean, it's certainly a very violent, and I mean, someone's right there doing it with their, even if they have a belt, you're sort of killing someone with your bare hands. It seems quite different than, you know, standing at a distance and pulling the trigger of a gun or pushing a button on a bomb or something. It's a very, it seems like a more brutal way.
Right, but I guess the point I'm making is, if this carbon footprint hoax is being perpetrated excuse me, by artificial intelligence expert system or fuzzy logic algorithms, we have that notion that the algorithms themselves have no conscience or no empathy. So that would be consistent with the brutality visited upon the Shermans and John Benet Ramsey. You're strangling these people. And I think the logic, the sort of the moral or immoral logic behind it is, well, since carbon dioxide being emitted by human beings is going to drive the Earth to catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, then we, and I'm talking about the royal we of the Serco investors and the bankers at the Rothschild, we have a duty to strangle society or cut their emissions. They use this amazing word, neutralize emissions. Well, how do you neutralize carbon emissions other than by killing the party that's producing them or destroying their infrastructure? Over to you.
Right. Well, I mean, in response to the question of, you know, what causes death in strangulation, I just found this brief explanation. It's saying that suicide ligature strangulation. Strangulation is compression of the neck that may lead to unconsciousness or death by causing an increasingly hypoxic state in the brain. And I do believe that means lack of oxygen.
Right. But either way, you know that we had those amazing images of paradise in California.
Yes.
Right. Effectively, I imagine myself behind or in one of those Maxar control rooms with, is it Dynaglobe? Looking down, digital globe perhaps.
Yeah.
You know, excuse me, that picture that you had, where the trees, which of course mop up carbon dioxide, are untouched. but the houses containing people who are breathing out carbon dioxide and the energy that goes into their houses generating carbon dioxide have been obliterated. And that looks to me like a crime where they're actually, in their minds, talking about neutralizing emissions of built-up areas, a sort of deindustrialization activity. So now, when you take the images that look down on that, I could imagine, if I was a real cynic, that at the top right-hand corner there is a digital readout which is estimating the amount of carbon dioxide saved by weight, right, as those houses are hit with microwave links from Maxar satellites. So as you go through paradise and you knock out 80 or 90% of the houses, maybe, and I'm suggesting that's actually what happened. There's the photograph. I mean, isn't that extraordinary? What is about 10%, I suppose, of the homes there that still seem to have the roofs on.
Yeah, what's up with
Everything
that?
else is basic. Sorry?
I mean, that's quite strange that it's just like each house is crushed and then these two are saved, this row is okay. That's bizarre. And there's trees in between these houses that are seemingly okay.
Right, and at the top right-hand side of that, I think, is the image, is, if you can scroll to it, is the name of the company.
Yeah, Digital Globe, a Maxar company.
Yeah, okay. Digital Globe, Maxar company. Now, Maxar is primarily McDonald, Detweiler and Associates of Richmond, British Columbia, that's been merged and played around with, and it now has it holds four companies: McDonald, Detweiler, Digital Globe, Radiant, and SSL, which is a small satellite operation. So this is an example, I think, where our listeners and yourself and myself, we can look at that, and we are now in the process of discovery, which I think is just totally exciting, Jason. Because as you point out, what is with those two houses? Untouched, right? Yeah. Standing by themselves, and trees between the houses untouched. Well, here's what I suggest. Go into the patent office, see if you can find any microwave transmitters that are basically in the custody of Maxar, McDonald Detweiler, or the Maxar director, Joanne Isham, who's formerly with the CIA, and ask yourself, would it be possible to take several satellites with high-powered microwave transmitters and point them at the particular houses you want to obliterate, on the grounds that each house that you knock out, you then save some carbon emissions, because that house has no longer got human beings living in it, right? So they're not going to produce carbon dioxide. The house itself that uses energy that generates carbon dioxide as a byproduct of the energy process, that's gone away. So you could actually start adding up the weight of carbon saved as you work the forest fires. And actually, that was another thing that occurred to me. That's not a forest fire; it's a house fire in paradise. The forest is untouched.
The forest didn't burn. Yeah, yeah.
So we call it a forest fire, and that again is the way these people use language. And what they want to do is to tell the sheeple, that's you and me and everyone else around the world, forest fires are breaking out because of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming due to human beings, but they're not forest fires. They're house fires. Yeah. In fact, so what we're looking at is arson from space.
Wow. You know, David, I think in our last conversation I mentioned that it seems that just you and I talking about McDonald Detweiler and some of the things that you've brought up have resulted in my YouTube feed now having some new video recommendations, and I saw actually a really good documentary. I should retrieve it so we can talk about it, and I'll share it with you. But it was all about Digital Globe, and they had some of the founders or some of the principals talking about how initially their satellites were the size of a bus, but now they have new satellites that are the size of a toaster, and they spoke about the resolution at which they can photograph the Earth and who some of the customers for that photography are. And there was, and I'm not sure if this guy was with Digital Globe or a competitor, but he spoke specifically about satellites that did things beyond photography, where they were actually bouncing microwaves off of things on the ground and then almost like, if you have a camera, you shine light on the thing you want to see, and the reflected light is what the camera photographs. This guy was talking about a satellite that would beam microwaves onto the Earth and then read the reflected microwaves back up at the satellite. And it's kind of amazing to think about that, because I mean, you think about a satellite up there, well, how would it make a beam strong enough to hit the Earth and cause a fire? But I suppose it's possible.
Well, you're talking about radar,
Radar.
You realize,
Yeah.
which was invented, to all intents and purposes, by the British in World War II, where a cavity magnetron was stolen briefly from the labs at Birmingham University by a guy called Victor Rothschild, who returned it a few days later, warning the professor who had been involved in the development of taking more care of security. But then Victor Rothschild appears to have sent Sir Henry Tizard, the chief scientist, to the United States in 1940. And Tizard took a prototype of the cavity magnetron, and it was, of course, turned into production by RCA, which is the parent company of RCA GB 1929, which became Serco. That's the beauty of the patent office. But I digress. Going back to that forest fire, so what you've got is this strangler metaphor that maybe I'm overplaying. I hope not. But if you look at the patent, and let me just go and get the proper title of that patent that came out of CFPH, which I think is Cantor Fitzgerald. Yes. Methods and systems for combining securities and carbon credits. Maybe you could check that up. It's the original assignee is CFPH.
Yes. I've got it coming right up here.
Go to the picture there while you're getting that up, and you read it. What's fascinating here, and I think this is the core of the carbon footprint hoax and the 9/11 attack, is they've created a system, and just it's by no means a diversion with CFPH. Cantor Fitzgerald lost 658 people in its offices at the top of the North Tower in 9/11. That is a huge number of people, no matter how big the company is. It actually gutted the company's ability in New York to become or be the world's largest broker in US government securities, Eurobonds, and sovereign debt. And guess where the computers kicked in immediately after or while the dust was settling in New York, Jason?
Well, you've told me before, it's London.
Absolutely. Presumably under the control of the Boston Bruiser.
Brooklyn
right?
Bruiser.
Leomitis.
I thought he's the Brooklyn Bruiser.
Oh, sorry. Yes, okay. You're right. The Brooklyn Bruiser. I don't know if the Bruisers are very different in either place, but he's a thug, right?
The accent
Very
will
obvious.
be different.
Yes. But would the moral principles be any different? And what I'm getting at here is, I think you have a system where the algorithms have been programmed to tot up the amount of carbon saved by weight as you go through a process driven and ultimately initiated and stopped by an expert system algorithm. That is to say, they stopped destroying New York when they'd reached a certain weight of carbon saved in the attack. They stopped the attacks in Washington when they had reached a certain amount of carbon saved, which they presumably or think they'd achieved by taking out the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center. Now, the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center, I keep telling Americans, I don't know why I, as a Brit, Canadian up here with no background in intelligence, have to say, I think, and I'm not being patronizing or confrontational, I'm just saying to Americans generally, why do you think the guy in a cave in Afghanistan straddling a yak would want to take out the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center? That's a strategic target, not a tactical one. Al-Qaeda, if it really exists, and I have great doubts about it, it'll blow up some, low passengers in a train or whatever and feel it's achieving its target. But the United States of America on the morning of 9/11 lost the most important military asset it has, which is the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center. So I say to Americans, where do you think the functionality of that command center went? Right? You've got George Bush, the commander-in-chief in the elementary school. But coming back to this word neutralization, you see, a first amount of carbon credit. Sorry, if you just go back to the patent, I'm just looking at the wording.
Is this one it?
A carbon footprint of the at least one security may be calculated. A first amount of carbon credit necessary to neutralize, repeat, neutralize the carbon footprint of the at least one security may be determined. A second amount of carbon credit may be purchased based on the act of calculating the first amount of carbon credit necessary. A financial instrument determined to have an at least partially neutralized carbon footprint may be generated by causing the at least one security and the second amount of carbon credit to be stored in a trust. Well, that sounds like gobbledygook, but it actually is exceedingly sinister, because what it means, you can have a trust, a private equity group, an opaque pension fund manager or an investment manager, which is outside the reach of the FBI or the normal scrutiny of the people who are expert in those kind of things. I believe, is Charles Ortel a forensic, he can track stuff through these kind of accounts?
He's quite good, yes, at complex fraud examination.
Well, maybe you could ask him to look at this, because maybe the Clinton Foundation is structured as a trust, right, to do exactly what this patent describes.
Well, he's spoken about trusts for sure.
Yes, to take a security. Let's say Boeing, and remember Boeing was forced to move its headquarters from Washington State to Chicago, and it was commissioned just before 9/11. Boeing would be seen by these clowns as a spewer of carbon dioxide, because planes fly around the world and that's what comes out of the tail end of those engines, right? Yeah. So maybe they're told, well, we can't put you in our investment trust because you produce too much carbon dioxide. So periodically we want to force you to buy some carbon credits, which might be, and how do you sell a carbon credit? Well, by neutralizing the asset. So why wouldn't Serco, the world's largest air traffic controller and the preferred supplier, excuse me, of command and control equipment to Boeing, why wouldn't Serco serve as a purveyor, if that's the right word, of carbon credit as measured in the weight of carbon saved when it takes one of the aircraft it's controlling out of the skies and crashes it into the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center?
But doesn't it still burn up all the fuel and create all the carbon? I mean, it seems a little bit counterintuitive that destroying the plane would somehow save carbon. Why not just...
Well, because now the plane is not going to spend the next 20 or 30 years flying around the world spewing out carbon dioxide.
But won't Boeing just make another plane and sell it to that airline?
Of course, but I'm not saying these people are, you know, if I subject these people to my deductive computing machine, I would recognize them as psychopaths and put them away, right? But these people aren't logical, because the whole argument behind catastrophic anthropogenic global warming is not based on science. It's based on a perception that people can be manipulated into believing anything they're told.
Well, right. That's it, is that the whole thing doesn't really make sense. It's just something they've sold to everybody.
From a reverse engineering of a crime scene, it makes perfect sense, because they've taken this concept of carbon, greenhouse gas, for an example. If you go in a greenhouse, I believe, I have a friend, erstwhile friend, Timothy Ball. He's a historical climatologist, and he's 100% against this carbon footprint hoax. And he said somewhere, maybe you can find it, that inside a greenhouse, carbon dioxide concentrations is kept at 2,000 parts per million because it is a greenhouse gas, and it makes the plants grow. If you lower the carbon dioxide percentage or distribution in the greenhouse, the plants are going to wither and die. And that's why I say to my green friends, not that I have very many, you'd then have to change your name to the Brown Party, because the plants have withered away. But I say they don't find that particularly amusing. But
is this him, David, the D-Smog blog?
I don't. Yes, that's the man, Timothy Ball, great guy. He's a historical climatologist, brilliant man, right? And he's been railing against this carbon scam for years. But and I'll do a quick digression. One of the reasons why the universities have embraced the climate change scam, it gives a whole bunch of professors and faculty members a chance at tenure if they investigate global warming. Whether they'll find it or not is another issue. So he's a very, very smart guy.
Yeah, well, he's a professor of geography at the University of Winnipeg. Well, he was until 1996. Prolific speaker. He's been the chairman of the now defunct Natural Resources Stewardship Project to the Exxon-funded Friends of Science. Now, so people would argue immediately that Exxon funding a scientist is going to have an interest in finding one result that may differ from what somebody else might want to find.
Oh yeah, but that's the deniers. You know, they'll basically say you're associated with this. I mean, you're being subjected to this kind of stuff all the time, Jason. Less so myself. It's very interesting. You can't dodge those kind of comments. You know, smears by association. Equally, right. You can't spend enough time to defend yourself. So my attitude is ignore it and carry on with what I think is really exciting, just as you pointed out. When you pointed out those two houses side by side with their roofs intact, that to me is a discovery in the court of public opinion, which is yours and the show that we do together. So we can go to any crime scene anywhere in the world and see if we can make those connections, which I'm finding, as you know, are in the patent office. And what I'm particularly interested now, I think I got my timing a little bit wrong with today's show, otherwise I would have prepared it or included it, is this Motorola invention relating to encrypted communications by radio. Because if you go back to the New York on 911, you know that the fire department of New York had their radios taken away and replaced. And those radios, let me just turn that off. And those radios were allegedly, some of them were replaced with a modern Motorola radio that was faulty in certain parts of the World Trade Center. At the end of the day, the firefighters of New York, they lost 343 people, allegedly in some of those cases, because the people in the second tower to come down, and that was the first tower to be hit. So the first tower to come down was the South Tower, WTC2, and the second tower to come down was WTC1, the North Tower, where 658 of the people working for Cantor Fitzgerald were killed, including Howard Lutnick's brother. Now, wouldn't that be interesting if there were a two-tier radio system in New York at the time? One is a system that could not be relied on in various nooks and crannies of the World Trade Center, but another one that was perfectly reliable, used by the red team attackers to count the number of firefighters that would be in that building when they came down, so you could achieve your target for carbon emissions saved by killing members of the fire department of New York. Now, the survivors of that attack, they wouldn't know how this attack was put together or how the man in the middle attack was executed. All they would know, or perhaps sense, is, let me go back to your earlier words, a globalist force, which they didn't understand, that could kill an arbitrary number of their colleagues, bring down two towers, and bring America to its knees. What I'm suggesting is it's almost yours and my job, Jason, to expose that, because we've got certain gifts, but we are now at the right time where the technology offers you on your show input from hundreds, if not thousands of people who can analyze one of these cases, right, and identify the particular radio that might fit that crime scene footprint. That is to say, one set of radios that don't work with any degree of reliability and could be jammed so that a certain number of firefighters don't get the evacuation order, and another set of radios that allow the conspirators to actually spot fix the number of firefighters killed in this attack.
Well, David, what about this technology that Motorola is advertising on their website that is over-the-air rekeying that allows, you know, the user to change encryption keys on the fly?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I worked for a company in artificial intelligence in the UK called Rakel, that had a frequency hopping battlefield radio system that was very effective. I would imagine that these kind of technologies are the same, but their DNA, Jason, is in the Patent Office, the United States Patent and Trademark Office, which wasn't hijacked in 1940, but it effectively, I believe, was merged with the United Kingdom Patent Office, with the Tizard mission, because Sir Henry Tizard brought some key technologies vital to the outcome of World War II. If I can remember some, he brought the cavity magnetron, the proximity fuse, basic calculations for the plutonium bomb, friend or foe identification, and chain theory for radar systems. Those technologies, obviously with very brave people on all sides and very capable people, helped to bring the end of World War II forward by 2 or 3 years, they believe, and save a lot of lives. What was the legacy, of course, is now that the United States Patent and Trademark Office and the British Patent Office are joined at the hip. You can't separate them out.
Now, David, let me just interrupt you for a moment, because there's a few things we want to cover. First of all, I want to remind everyone that this is our sort of preview show to our Patreon-only show that will be beginning just at 1 p.m. So I want to remind all of our viewers who are watching right now on YouTube or Periscope or DLive or Facebook or any of the other platforms that we're on, if you're watching on patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, please also go to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards. It's very important that David has our financial support so these shows can continue, and David will be wrapping up here on YouTube in just about 15 minutes and heading over to Patreon. But I wanted to bring to your attention this patent that I'm sure you're looking at intently right now. This is the patent was issued in 1995, so certainly this technology, it was filed in February of 1994, so I mean, you know, this was obviously available at the time of the World Trade Center attacks in New York. This is a method for over-the-air rekeying of multiple communication groups. So it would seem, this says, in a secure communication system, 100, communication units in different communication groups. I don't know what this 100 indicates. I'm sure that doesn't limit the number of groups to 100, but that's probably referencing something elsewhere in the document. Communication units in different communication groups may be simultaneously rekeyed over the air by having a managing key unit generate a key packet. So it seems like this is saying if you had, let's say, 100 people using radios and 10 of them knew something sinister was going to happen, they could go out in the field and create a secure sub-network within the network that the other 90 could not listen to, and the 10 out of 100 could be given some sort of instruction in a secure, encrypted way.
You've nailed it, Jason. And that's what, remember, Franti, I think, made the first box, friend or foe identification. What the British had to do was to identify enemy aircraft, you know, Luftwaffe aircraft. There are a few shooting downs of friendlies. Excuse me. So they invented this friend or foe box made by Ferranti and took it to the Americans, and the Americans adopted it. And guess what? Jerome Lemelson has a patent for friend or foe identification. Excuse me. And exactly as you described, you can switch from friend to foe and back again, leaving your friend sucking air, which is what happened on 911. And going back to the pig farm in British Columbia, when McDonnell Detweiler developed mobile radio data systems for the Vancouver Police and the RCMP in the late 60s and early 70s, they would have been able to send the killers out to the pig farm as insider guests, together with a victim captured from the downtown east side, to be killed by these people, and put them as sort of man-in-the-middle attack on the otherwise innocent guests who had been invited to what they thought was a federally registered charity. So I think they they calibrated this method, this strangulation and neutralizing carbon emission method, in Canada, in British Columbia, in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. And when they'd perfected it, effectively it's a means of launching a man-in-the-middle attack that is undetected. You can infiltrate and exfiltrate the killers. And then they carried it on to the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center, where Ramzi Youssef was put in a jail by Christine Marcy, Field McConnell's sister, together with Timothy McVeigh, where I believe Field McConnell's sister had him executed in 2001, make sure he didn't blow the whistle on the 9/11 attack, and Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who appears to have been quite inventive because most of the patented devices he used in his explosives appear to have been attributed to a guy called Ray Detling, Detling. So
sounds again, a lot like Detweiler.
Well, I think that's a coincidence. But what Christine Marcy, Field McConnell's sister, did, in my opinion, is she created a Conair pod at ADX Florence of 3 people who were quite expert in blowing things up and killing people. Ramzi Youssef, 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. Ted Kaczynski, allegedly from, 1978, the first bomb to Northwestern University, up to his arrest in 1995. And Timothy McVeigh, who's accused of blowing up the Murrah building. And incidentally, amongst one of the places they put the bomb was underneath the child daycare center.
Yeah,
so you're
crazy.
back to this total lack of inhibitions, the bizarre absence of compassion or empathy, which I know because I'm, if I may arrogantly claim, I'm probably a pioneer of artificial intelligence and working expert systems, because I built the first one that worked on any commercial scale for Britoil in Glasgow. If I look at these murder scenes, and of course back then when I was working in artificial intelligence, I didn't really visualize how it might be hijacked, that technology, and used for nefarious purposes. What I see is the absence of compassion or empathy for the victims is the signature of the perpetrators who are using algorithms to execute the crime. Over to you.
Well, I've just been Googling a bit while you're telling us about that. It seems Werner Detweiler is the founder, and he died in 2013. There was this other
with John
article.
McDonald.
What's that?
Yeah, he founded it with John McDonald. I think they were both up at UBC, University of British Columbia.
Uh-huh. Well, Werner Detweiler sounds like he comes from somewhere other than Canada, but we can talk about that later. So this is talking about how Google sold Motorola to Lenovo in 2014. But was Motorola a standalone company? I mean, they were very involved in radio stuff when they started. Was it somehow linked to RCA or General Electric or anything like that ever?
Oh, you know what? Your head will spin when you look at the way these companies merge and break up and disappear. But I'll tell you the core of the conspirators that is maintained, and that's their signature. They're doing what I call herding patents. They don't care about the name, right? For example, no one seems to be worried in the United States, military and intelligence, that Freescale Semiconductors has been sold together with all of its patents, which were developed in many cases with taxpayer funding for the Department of Defense and stealth technology, have been sold to a Dutch semiconductor company.
David, am I incorrect, but wasn't Freescale Semiconductor spun off of Motorola?
I think it might have been. And remember, there were 20 Freescale Semiconductor top flight technicians on that MH370.
Right.
May I just interrupt in case we
Sure.
run into a scheduling problem? Can I take an hour after this show to go and do various things and then come back to Patreon? Does that work for you, Jason?
We can certainly schedule it for later than 1 p.m. Yeah, I'm going to be speaking with Larry Nichols at 3. He's got something urgent he wants to share with us. Maybe you and I could reconvene.
2 o'clock your time?
Sure. We could be 2 o'clock on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and also patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. But we've still got some time here, and actually, if you want to do that, David, we could go for about another 20 minutes here on YouTube if you have the time right now.
Yes. Let's carry on now for the top of the hour.
Sure.
Then I need to get away for an hour and then come back.
Right. So this does say Freescale was one of the first semiconductor companies in the world, having started as a division of Motorola in Phoenix, Arizona in 1948.
Right. And so McDonald Detweiler develops that mobile radio data system, sells it to Motorola. So on 911, Motorola would have had the capability of switching keys between friends and foe and ultimately ambushing a whole bunch of firefighters in those buildings, whilst, and dare I say it, I believe the fire department of New York is just as much a target for infiltration as your show and my show, or, you know, what we try and do, because the forces out there, they have this strangulation, neutralization of emissions, contempt for human beings, the idea of deindustrializing society. So anything that they see as a threat to that, of course, becomes a target. Most targets can just be swamped by, you know, fake truths or smeared by association until they're discredited. But what I find so fascinating when you go in the patent office, the language of the patent and the signature of the crime, they can be correlated to a very high degree.
Yeah, that does seem to be the case.
If you look at, I'm sure the fire department of New York has got just as many capable professional people as any firefighting service anywhere in the world. But to have a radio glitch, if that's probably the kindest expression, that ends up with one tower coming down and the firefighters in the other tower not getting the evacuation order, is absurd. That was an ambush. It was a hack. They basically herded those poor men and women. I don't know if the women were able to get to that top floor with all the kit they carry, but they wanted to send a message to the fire department of New York. And here's where we come back right to the beginning. The fire department of New York will be a member of the pension fund for New York City Employees Retirement System. And the New York City Employees Retirement System was an investor in Orbital Sciences, which bought McDonald Detweiler. So I think what's happening is going back to that trust and the the security, where one part of the trust buys a carbon credit from a company like Serco, which is the weight of carbon saved when you crash a plane.
Wait,
and you
sorry, David. So Orbital ATK is the thing, right? That's the Orbital?
Yes.
So it's, I just looked that up, and it says that it's Northrop Grumman.
Yeah, well, they shuffle around. The ownership is really not so interesting, because the parent trusts that have invested in all of these companies, you know, like Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin, are the global custodian shareholders of Serco that met on the 47th floor of the North Tower on the morning of 9/11. So, Jason, what I'm thinking is that is a trust, effectively, where you've got some companies that are violating the carbon cap these clowns say that we need to keep below, and they're talking about 350 parts per million, which is below the level of the Earth that has ever been. And they're neutralizing securities that violate this with people who are selling carbon credits like Serco. So on the morning of 9/11, on the 47th floor, Serco shareholders met. Just out of curiosity, maybe Americans don't know that included amongst the shareholders of Serco on the morning of 9/11 at the meeting on the 47th floor would have been representatives from the government of Saudi Arabia. Well, why sue the government of Saudi Arabia for its role in perpetrating 9/11? Why not sue Serco for the wrongful deaths associated with its shareholders negligent, reckless, willful, or fraudulent use of patented devices, which comes back to my basic theory. The remedy for this is in the court of public opinion, which is what we've got right now, discovery, which is what we've got right now, and people such as a firefighter community of families who lost loved ones on 911, understanding that, oops.
Nice ringtone, David.
Oh, I'm surrounded by technology that grew too late in my life to understand. But again, you realize there was $100 trillion of assets under management at that meeting on the 47th floor. Many of those assets under management would include companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman. So I think the directors of Boeing on the morning of 9/11 were helpless. They knew this was happening well in advance. They knew that they'd been moved from Washington State headquarters down to Chicago, which is Obama land. They knew what was coming down the line, and they felt helpless to stop it because they were up against a monster, you know, like J. Edgar Hoover described it, a conspiracy so monstrous an individual cannot believe it exists.
Right. Now, David, I may be guilty of an ADD redirect here, but in our just earlier conversation here about Motorola, I was Googling them, and this is talking about how, you know, it was the semiconductor division was started in the 1940s, and in 1955 they made a Motorola transistor for car radios. And obviously in the 50s, Motorola was best known for radios. And this says in the 1960s, one of the US space program's goals was to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. In 1968, NASA began manned Apollo flights that led to the first lunar landing. And it talks about how, you know, Motorola created the division that eventually became Freescale Semiconductor, created this transponder that transmitted voice and television. There were a lot of people who question the moon landing and say that it was fake and that the United States did not go to the moon. Have you and I ever discussed that?
No, and those kind of statements or lines of inquiry, they can be very absorbing of your time. I personally think, well, the Shermans are dead. Someone killed them. Right? Can we trace it back through the patent office? Now, if you wanted to perpetrate an illusion of a moon landing, what I would do and spend any significant time is look into the patent office and see about holograms or projections or what kind of devices can plug into the communication systems to create the impression, for example, of a moon landing or an Al-Qaeda attack. Well, we have the Bin Laden statement or clue being injected by General Alexander Haig at 9 o'clock on the morning of 9/11. The camera is very conveniently pointing at the gash in the north face of the North Tower. And General Haig is asked, well, who do you think is behind it? And he said, well, I don't want to speculate, which means he's just about to. And from the clown script, he says, well, we know where to look. It's the Palestinians or Bin Laden groups. That's 14 minutes after impact. Well, they were in the middle of a war game, right? Where the British and the Canadians had structured the Red Team attack. And the Americans were caught unawares because those Red Team attacks had been prosecuted since 1947 by way of training. The Americans always assumed that, and of course they generally can assume, that Canada and Britain are allies. However, that is not true of all of Canada or all of the United Kingdom. You have enemies, both domestic and foreign, unfortunately, in the United States, just like every other country. And I think, unfortunately, your enemies, domestic and foreign, are working together with the most advanced technology available to create the phantom enemies out there, and America is chasing its tail. Over to you.
Well, yeah, a lot of our viewers, David, think that the moon landing was faked, and we've got Rise Above in Periscope asking me if I've seen the documentary called Room 47. I think it's called Room 247, and it's all about the making of the movie The Shining, because, of course, the rumor is that Stanley Kubrick was the filmmaker used to create the motion picture segments that were used on television, etc., to show the moon landing. And of course, Stanley Kubrick was the director of 2001, A Space Odyssey. I've actually, in my film career, had the opportunity to meet Douglas Trumbull several times. Douglas Trumbull was the visual effects supervisor on 2001, and when I had my career in Hollywood, I was a member of the Visual Effects Society, and I think it must have been, I guess, the 50th anniversary of that, or no, the 40th anniversary of that film in 2009, or thereabouts. I don't remember, maybe 2007, something like that. They showed the film, and Douglas Trumbull was there speaking about not holograms and stuff, but the visual effects techniques that they developed to photograph models and make it look like they were in space and things like that. And I mean, Room 237 is the name of the film. It talks about that hotel room in another Kubrick film, The Shining, and how the movie The Shining is loaded with hidden imagery. I guess you'd call it steganography, encoded messages within the film, where the little kid is wearing an Apollo t-shirt, and they show models of spacemen and stuff like that, and people have speculated that this is Kubrick trying to clue us in to the falsified moon landing.
Well,
but the other, sorry, David, one last thing on this. The other theory is that they did go to the moon, but they were concerned that in case the mission failed, they didn't want the Soviets, the Cold War was in its height, and they didn't want to risk it failing, so they made these films to show everybody, to convince them that it happened in case it didn't.
Well, I mean, I would say, and I'm not being, well, I hope I'm not being negative, I'm just saying that if one wants to think about what cinematography can create by way of an illusion, I think from a survivor of the Republic's point of view, Americans would be well advised to understand how to make what Dr. Thomas Barnett described as the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history on 911.
Right.
I mean, you as someone with a Hollywood background, how would you do that? Well, I think there's a BBC interview with the anchorman back in London, who's talking with Kate, forget the surname. Anyway, she's sending in a report from New York, and she's saying up on the screen, we're getting a report that the Salomon Smith Barney building has come down, and it's still standing behind her left shoulder. Right? So there's a synchronization problem. The demolition squad got ahead of the film squad. Then I think there's a CNN or Fox News obviously getting the same feed from the red team. And you've got a black woman and two white, and the colors are irrelevant, but they're talking about the attack, and they're saying a similar feed that the Salomon Smith Barney building is coming down. And again, it's standing up over the left shoulder. And then the camera moves away from the sort of horizon, and I think the woman says, "Oh, it's coming down now." Right?
Right.
You see, so again, if you're talking about special effects, someone with a deep and profound knowledge of special effects staged the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history. But the crime scene signature shows a very specialized set of patented devices, systems, and methods were deployed, including, as we frequently point out, Lockheed Martin's hardened rocket-boosted penetrator bomb,
right,
which punched a hole through 8 walls of the Pentagon into the inner courtyard. That wasn't any Boeing passenger jet, right?
Right. Well, a couple of other things worth mentioning. Of course, Larry Silverstein famously has said they made the decision to pull it, so he seemed to know something about the deliberate destruction of that building. We just had on Crowdsource the Truth earlier this week an interview with the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 inquiry, and I think you and I discussed this in our last conversation, that they've convinced the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York here to actually impanel a grand jury that's going to be investigating the evidence that's been found. So perhaps we'll learn more about 9/11 in the near future. There's one other important distinction I wanted to let you know about, David. In the movie industry, there's an important distinction between special effects and visual effects. Special effects would be the guys that would rig a building to explode or a car crash or, that type of thing. Those guys are considered the special effects department. But the visual effects department refers specifically to computer generated imagery and that type of thing. So, I mean, it's interesting conversation to have, to think about if special effects were used. I mean, someone with skills in special effects could conceivably rig a building to be demolished, or there's a lot of times in Hollywood I would meet people who would start in one career and then move to another. So if you were an expert in building demolition and decided you wanted to go to Hollywood, I do think the special effects department would be where you would land, because you'd have experience with explosives, and those guys are highly skilled. They usually also work for the fire department.
Well, another great pool of talent for putting on 9/11 attack is Christine Mars's prison system, right? I mean, where she got the Gore Hammer Award, I believe, for launching JPATS, Justice, Prison and Alien Transportation System. Actually, it was founded by her in 1984 when she bought a Boeing 737 with money stolen from the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund, which you and I have discussed. If you wanted a pool of explosive expert, well, why not go to the ADX Florence pod? I mean, she's just had Timothy McVeigh executed, presumably because he was about to blow the whistle on what was coming down on 9/11. But she still had the residual talents of Ramzi Youssef and Ted Kaczynski, who are all claimed to be pretty good with explosives. And so then poor Field, I think he's a pawn in his sister's puppetry, but I'm not responsible for unraveling these man-in-the-middle attacks that are so complex that maybe we shouldn't be calling them man-in-the-middle attacks. Maybe we should be calling them women-in-the-middle attacks and start talking to Joanne Isham, the former CIA boss, who apparently opened the National Imaging and Mapping Agency, where you can create simulations, and presumably a wonderful spot for special effects of the type you just described. Over to you.
Well, and as you mentioned Field McConnell, I can't help but think of the friend or foe warning system, where the friend switches to foe. I don't want to get too much into that conversation, but I think that people that follow Field and you and I might know what I'm talking about, but he seems to oscillate between those two positions in a strange way. David, I was listening this morning to, as you talk about Christine Marcy and the prison transport system, I was listening this morning to George Stephanopoulos had interviewed Donald Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, who of course was sentenced to 3 years in prison earlier this week. And it occurred to me that some of the people that we have associated with 9/11, like Dick Cheney, he was a principal at a company called Core Civic, which used to be Corrections Corporation of America. I believe it's the largest private prison company in the United States. Dick Cheney was indicted for prison profiteering in Texas, and it's, I've thought a lot about this idea that you basically introduced to me, where controlling these prisons and controlling the transport of prisoners, it really does give you quite a bit of control over a person, because let's imagine a situation where Robert Mueller, for instance, can question Michael Cohen, or anyone for that matter, and say, hey, Michael, we have 5 counts of some, felony, lying to federal agents or election campaign finance fraud or whatever. And if they stack them all up and say, well, this is 25 years in prison, you're a 52-year-old guy, you want to die in prison, or you want to live the rest of your life with your wife and your kids and all that, you start to see how pressure can be applied to this guy. And certainly for the next 3 years while he's in prison, they've got a high degree of control over him because they can make it very clear to someone like Michael Cohen that once you're in that prison, the ability for you to die and go away, it becomes, I mean, very easy for that to happen. So they, getting someone wrestled to the ground, as it were, stuck in prison, this seems to be the specialty of Robert Mueller and the FBI and the DOJ, and now we hear that Michael Flynn, they're going to go really easy on him, and even, I don't know if you've heard this in Canada, David, but Michael Flynn's sentencing is coming up next week in Washington, D.C., and the judge that's been assigned to that is Judge Emmett Sullivan, who just yesterday, I believe, demanded today that the FBI present the 302 documents, which are the written transcripts of the interviews. And of course, we remember that True Pundit had a story long ago that Andrew McCabe had modified and or destroyed these 302 interviews with Michael Flynn. So I think we're seeing a lot of facts and details surrounding the method by which these people are entrapped and pressured, and it ties into what you have always said with Christine Marcy controlling the prisoner transport system and having these hit squads in prison. I mean, it really does become this bizarre subculture, and we've heard that since Bill Clinton's presidency, the United States prison population has absolutely exploded. So it's almost like a secret psychopathic army.
You got it. And the mens rea, and because people will always wonder mens rea, and I want to avoid tying the solution of the crime to the identification of the mens rea, but when I talk about the application of those algorithms, you do need a mens rea to allow something that has no compassion or inhibitions about killing children. And I think what Christine Marcy has done brilliantly is to create this veneer of respectability for DOJ pride. But that's another issue. Do you mind if I slip away now?
Yeah, no
Jason?
problem, David. We'll reconvene at 2. And
yes, okay, all right. Can we just
1 hour from now?
Yeah, okay, right. Thanks,
okay.
Bye.
Thank you, David. And so people can rejoin David and I later today on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, and also, of course, patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. David had to run there, but we will be back in just 1 hour. And I'm going to be quite busy today because I've received a call from Larry Nichols. Larry wants to have a conversation about what he's described as an urgent matter pertaining to the pending Democratic impeachment of President Donald Trump. So I hope everyone will join us at 2, and then I'll be back shortly after that with Larry Nichols. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you in just an hour, only on Patreon.